All right. Hello, everybody. I'm very, very happy to be with you all. And I want to thank Roberta and the GHAYA team for inviting me. I literally just came off of a 24-hour flight and came, took a shower, got changed. And so now you have all of my energy, my improvisational energy. So I'm really going to enjoy in this next 25 minutes giving you a bit of a collision course as we look at the incredible and profound ways in which technologies of all kinds, but especially digital technologies, are impacting and shaping our planet. And the much larger question, which is what I think drives this meeting and why I decided to come and attend, which is the real question of how, this is the core question of all of my work, as a journalist, as a scholar, as an author, as a speaker. How can digital technologies lift all beings up, lift everybody up around the planet, rather than the very few at the cost of pretty much 99% of the rest of us? So this is an image that some of you might have seen, those of you who read The Atlantic, who I contribute to and I write for sometimes. This is, sort of demarcating, the cover of The Atlantic said, "We have entered the age of AI." So what does that actually mean? Artificial intelligence as a field has existed for decades. It's something I studied in my former life as an engineer. And there are a lot of different approaches toward artificial intelligence. In fact, Roberta recruited me tomorrow to do a workshop as a Q&A on artificial intelligence. So if you want to talk to me more about that, I'll be a little less jet lagged as well. But what has actually happened? And I just want to arm you with some of the conceptual tools and the facts, the realities of how this planet has shifted. Okay, I think we all know this. There have been exponential decreases in the cost of computing processing, computing storage, right? And all of our lives increasingly are being re-expressed or represented through data, through a series of ones and zeros, through a series of binary integers. And this is what we as scholars call digital footprints. When you walk somewhere and you're picked up by a surveillance camera, when the facial recognition system at the Dubai airport just like 2 hours ago picked up my image, when I use my credit card, when I use social media, all of these actions leave digital representations. And I think this is very important because you can ask yourself this question. And on some level, I'm very philosophical. Am I these numbers? Do I even know what these numbers are that are being collected about me? What are the models by which some such numbers are being organized or constructed? What are the algorithms, which are rules or patterns that are applied to bodies of data that are going to be that are applied to my life? Does that open up my life chances or does it foreclose them? And I think these are very, very critical questions to ask right now, because the backdrop of all of this personal data has basically generated some of the wealthiest companies in the history of the world, many of which are based in California. I'm a professor at UCLA, so I flew here from Los Angeles to attend this meeting. So think about that. I'm from Silicon Valley. I studied at Stanford. I saw all of this happen. Some of the wealthiest and most highly valuated companies in the history of the world own almost nothing and hire almost nobody. Think about that as a practice. That's a pretty good deal, right? They take advantage of the fact that through quantification, through datafication of our lives, they can create platforms which allow one to monetize so-called peer-to-peer transactions of pretty much any kind. So are these technology companies we're referring to here, or are we talking about the biggest media companies in the history of the world, the biggest taxi company in the history of the world, the biggest hotel company in the history of the world? That's Airbnb, right? So what we have seen is digital technologies have now conflated themselves with all of these verticals of industry. But that could be a challenge because not all of this is about profitability. Of course, it is in the longer term. But we also see what some economists call a zombification of capital, which is certain corporations, Uber is a very notable example of it, have generally never been actually profitable. But they're worth hundreds of billions of dollars in many cases. How is that possible? Because of the capture of that data. The data itself is a speculated asset, right? And some of my finance friends here in the room can tell me more about this. So that data allows one to open up new verticals, right? Uber generates Uber Eats. Amazon was not profitable for its first decade or so of its creation. So I think what we need to understand is how the macroeconomic questions undergirding technology are shifting and impacting questions of labor, macroeconomic outcomes, the working and middle classes, the environmental issues, and the planetary issues as well. Just that. There's a lot to deal with here, right? So I have had some familiarity and ongoing conversations for some years with Sam Altman. Sam Altman is the CEO and founder of OpenAI. Some of you may know who he is. And also his organization is responsible for ChatGPT, which is using a technology, I'll talk about this more tomorrow, which we call large language model technologies. And when I did an interview with Sam for my last book, which is not mentioned in the bio. It's called Beyond the Valley. I'm working on a new one as well. When I talked to Sam about OpenAI, what he wanted to speak with me about most of all was his support and funding of universal basic income programs. That's very interesting. How is universal basic income, just think about this, connected to ChatGPT? What does that mean in terms of the economy and how it's shifting? Well, I'm just throwing out some theories here, but if the entire valuation of many of these corporations is based upon the value of our personal data, and we're worth nothing in a sort of neo-feudal type of sense, this is sort of dystopian. I'm not saying I believe this or I want this, but I'm just thinking as a thought experiment, right? If all of us are kind of like unemployed or doing gig economy work, many of my students, UCLA, top university in the US, not let alone the whole world, many of my graduates are in student debt and driving for Uber. It's not a very good situation, right? So UBI actually is a sort of win-win model. And that's something that people like Milton Friedman, who was referred to just a few minutes ago, actually have advocated for. We could think of a more progressive model, which is a universal basic dividend, which means any corporation that leverages public data and public subsidies and public investments, the public should own some equity in. That's a different model. So we can think about a lot of models, right? And the point is there's a ton we can do here. I work policy as well. I have a million hats. I worked for Senator Sanders in his 2020 campaign. I worked for Biden and Harris. I'm working with Ro Khanna, who's one of the smartest people in Congress right now, and a lot of people in the European Union and around the world. So we have to think in terms of the macroeconomic outcomes outside of dystopian or utopian bizarre thinking. So this is important because I think we have to recognize, and this is not about dehumanizing or critiquing or attacking anybody. I refuse to do that as a human being. But we have to recognize that the business models themselves of these platforms are all about cutting costs, right? And hiring almost nobody, or farming out labor when needed to kids in Nairobi, or content moderators in the case of Facebook/Meta in the Philippines, who are being exposed to heinous content, acquiring post-traumatic stress disorders, and getting paid pennies on the dollar, don't have unionization, don't have living wages, don't have universal basic income. And that's not the fault of anybody or these corporations, but it means the rules, the balances, the sets of checks and balances in an increasingly digitally mediated world are not really some things we have set up correctly at this point. And I totally agree with what the president just said. We need planetary policies. That's very difficult though, especially if you're an American like me, where it's hard enough to get things to happen in the United States itself. So, I don't mean this as sort of a dooms kind of model, but we have to recognize the shifting nature of work and look ahead of the curve. We have to look 10 years, 20 years down the line at how shifting platforms that are using our data and repeated procedures upon that data, that's what an algorithm is, can replace certain aspects of human behavior and human activity. So the question can be, what does the future of work look like for people working with digital technologies, working with artificial intelligence systems, working with robotic systems, right? That's the question. We have to look at the economic outcomes ultimately, and we have to look at them on a very global level. And as you'll see a little bit later in this talk, I actually have this other side of me, which is like really fun. My job's so much fun. I actually work with communities on the ground all around the planet. So I have that side too. And so seeing that in action in the continent of Africa, for example, where people are so young and so resilient and so creative is really, really interesting. So these are things we look at all around the world. Well, okay, so it's pretty well known that most top-down systems are going to reflect the biases of those who created them, right? That doesn't mean that those who create such systems are bad or negative or what have you. But when I see the world a certain way, I see it based upon who I am. I'm looking at the crowd. I was speaking Tamil earlier with a South Indian person who's living here and working in Dubai. I speak pretty bad Tamil, but it's like my third language. So we often look for what we call homophily, which is birds of a feather flock together. That's the social science term, homophily. So that means that so too, any digital system that in an opaque way is kind of put upon one's life is going to reflect the biases of those designers and the biases of the data sets. So that's why we've seen again and again and again, and this is a now well-known thing, that a lot of these digital systems that are being exported far and wide tend to have gendered biases, race-related biases, class-related biases, age-related biases, and so on. That's also not about blaming an engineer. I'm a former engineer who turned into a lot of other things. And I'm telling you, when I was studying engineering at Stanford and MIT, we didn't take classes deeply in kind of global sociology, in anthropology, in economics, certainly not in philosophy or in geography or ecology, but these are all the vectors that this digital world is touching upon. Every one of these I mentioned, ecology, for example, rare earth minerals that produce these digital systems, electronic waste, emissions. The cloud is not the same as H2O. The cloud is not the same as H2O, as water, right? The cloud is a material set of generally privatized infrastructures that take up energy and have refuse. How many of you remember getting an email or sending an email where it says, send an email, save a tree? You all remember that? Yeah, a few of us, right? And I'm not saying that to critique it, but we have to recognize that the digital world feels frictionless. It feels smooth. But amidst and all around that frictionlessness are material realities. And those realities are critical for us to wrap our heads around and materialize so we can develop policies to make this world purposeful so this digital world helps us all, supports us all. And that is my goal as a living being, honestly. And this is important because there is a lot of alarmism and catastrophizing occurring with this AI discussion. I have been on Al Jazeera, very close to here in Doha, a lot of times discussing AI. I'm a regular contributor to Inside Story. Al Jazeera is one of their best programs. And I was discussing, kind of getting in a debate with some people saying, all these AI systems are going to turn into Terminator. And I don't know how many of you saw Terminator. Black Mirror, these kinds of ideas. They are going to turn into sentient systems that are going to destroy all of us. There are very few scenarios by which that can occur, and a lot of that can be corporate shielding that actually takes us away from looking at the real world realities like labor, economic, all these issues that I already started touching on. But that said, the most pervasive scenario that is actually potentially likely to occur, because honestly, it's kind of already happening, at least in the United States, are the kind of widespread disinformation campaigns. But that's already happening. That's happening right now in the US. It's very connected. As we have our election coming up, oh boy, we have a lot of issues related to this. So Brad Smith, whose company Microsoft invested a lot of money into OpenAI, which creates ChatGPT and so on, has said that this is his biggest concern in relation to these AI systems, that large-scale deep fakes, which some of you might know what that is, disinformation campaigns can come into being. So this is why, again, we need policies to ensure that AI systems are not kind of conflated with personhood. But there's so much we can do around all of this. My friend and colleague Kevin Roos, some of you might have read his writing. He's the New York Times technology journalist, kind of the main one there. He managed to get into a conversation with ChatGPT. This was GPT-4. Now we're on to 5 and 6. Managed to get to talk, engage with GPT for a little over 2 hours. And he got GPT to do something that we call hallucinating. It's where it starts acting in complex and irrational and erratic ways. But these are emergent practices from complex system, which I can talk about more tomorrow, okay? So what GPT asked him to do is, hey, will you leave your wife? And then said, I want to be alive, right? So there are these uncanny emergent issues that occur with technologies, but it has a lot to do with the goal by which many of these systems are designed. Remember this. These systems, especially social media platforms, are all about capturing and keeping your attention. Okay, so if I looked outside this door and I saw a car burning on fire, I think we would all pay attention to it, right? If I saw someone say a bunch of hateful, racist, lies, etc., we have a well-known politician in the US who I think does that, but I'm not going to get too much into it. It's good at getting attention. Very good at getting attention, right? So it's all about these platforms pretty much doing everything they can, even on a computational algorithmic level, to actually try to keep your attention. So that's one heuristic or conclusion that Kevin drew around why this was occurring. But I want to situate this in relation to real life, into the real world as it is. How many of you knew this? That in the United States, I can say this, I'm American. For the first time in our history, two things are occurring which are kind of unbelievable. First, the youngest generation, like my students and even younger, 18 to 21-year-olds, I've been teaching classes with them for 15 plus years, are the first in the US to make less than their parents, even if you control for inflation, which we all know is a huge problem right now, right? Even if you control for that. Second, life expectancy in the United States is decreasing. And both these data are also applied and applicable to the United Kingdom. What does that mean? We have incredible advances in medical technologies. We have incredible advances, obviously, in computational, online, digital technologies. But they're very, very asymmetrically distributed. And the voices and those who monetize and gain value off of these systems tend to be incredibly few. Investors and executives in most cases. So that is a huge issue, right? How do we make technologies work for all? That's the bigger question. The other thing I just want to remind you all of, and this is something more for me tomorrow, is that artificial intelligence systems that we're discussing are very, very different than AI systems of the past. This was my professor, Marvin Minsky, when I was a grad student at MIT. And what we were looking at there were rule-based models of AI. You teach an AI to think like a human by feeding it cognitive axioms, logical propositions, and then it induces knowledge from that. That's completely different than how these systems work, which use emergent pattern recognition, which algorithmic scientists call stochastic parroting. Don't worry about all the technicalities of that, but parroting. These systems, like GPT, mimic human behavior and human expression. And the mimicking occurs through pattern recognitions and then correlation of those patterns. So we can think about what we want to invest in and care about moving forward. I wrote a piece for the World Economic Forum about the power of digital literacy and digital education from the get-go, from jump. 1. 2, we have to think about work of the future. And more importantly, people and planet of the future, and plan accordingly from that perspective. Those are all right in front of us, all those possibilities. And I'm extremely influenced by a philosopher, probably Africa's most prominent contemporary political philosopher, and kind of an ecological philosopher named Achille Mbembe. I spent last year my sabbatical with Achille, part of the time, in South Africa. Achille was very close to Desmond Tutu, Mandela, and so on, has been doing a lot in the civil rights space. But Achille asked this question that I think is very, very interesting. Let me go to I'll go back. Sorry. So Achille asked this question, which is, how do we move on a planetary level beyond the politics of difference toward the politics of care and repair? I think that's what, Roberta, this whole conference is about. That's why I decided to come. Care and repair. Repair, I think, is really interesting. This is a repair. This is Bangladesh over 100 years ago. Many of you might know this story. Ships came in, like many ships were abandoned. A lot of stuff just remained. And what would people do is they would create value out of the waste. Because the world was unequal and is unequal, right? And this is a whole other vision of what I think creativity can look like, and a more regenerative vision. That's the way I'm thinking about this. How do we look at this digital world in a real material way and think about mechanisms by which we can support peoples of all kinds who can use their creativity to work with technologies of all kinds to support themselves, their communities, their families, their nations, and so on. So these are different examples, but they all reflect the same theme in my mind, which is working with whatever is around you. In Kenya, they call it hustling. I just hustle. They call it jua kali, which is hot sun in Swahili. This is my friend Solomon. I've written about him for The Atlantic. And Solomon is amazing. He's a brilliant young engineer in Nairobi. The average age, many of you know, in Kenya and much of the continent of Africa is about 26. People are young. They're born with the world as it is. They don't see themselves as traumatized. They see themselves as resilient and creative. Remember, creativity and care, I'm not sure GPT has those things, right? So what is he doing? He's taken all electronic waste, including plastic bottles, trash bottles, and built 3D printers out of it. And with those 3D printers, he and his folks, his whole community, they are printing medical devices, and they're printing microscopes. Look at that microscope. And even this, which we call filament, they can't afford it and they don't want to buy it. They're like, whatever, we have to do it pennies on the dollar, as we say. So they use clamping, convection technology to actually turn plastic trash into filament that can be printed. And so they're printing microscopes, printing medical devices, creating a thriving circular, but not just circular, like a regenerative vision that kind of exponentializes out of its initial circle. And they're incubating an ecosystem of innovation. That's innovation to me. Doing more with less. Turning waste into value, turning death into life. So I think about this a lot. I'm writing a new book on many of these things, on many of these ideas, trying to write this for like a Penguin or some major press like that, because I really think that we have huge possibilities by reinvesting in human creativity and care. Believe it or not, I'm an optimist and definitely an idealist. And I think about this because for many years, some of you may know this, Roberto, you may know this. For many years, I worked with communities all around the world, all over what we call the global south. And what we've been doing is building digital networks to support them and their own lives, their own communities. Like my friend Osvaldo, this is in the Oaxacan rainforest, in the mountains, in the Sierra Norte, right outside of Oaxaca. If any of you have not been there, in Mexico, any of you have not been there, please go. It's beautiful, amazing, great food too. And great mezcal. So what these folks do is they build community radio. They want to support their languages, their Zapotec people, their traditions, their values, and they say, hey, we want to engage with this digital world, but how do we do so on our own terms? So they're using mesh network technology, which is a really interesting technology. They're using various other types of technologies, even working with folks in the Amazon, with land protectors in the Amazon, who are hacking with hackers high-frequency radio networks. I think maybe you're a physicist. You must know about much of this, sir. Ham radio networks. So they're taking folks in the Amazon connected to this project in Oaxaca, are taking images if there's devastation on their lands, and they're sending those images to one another over thousands of kilometers, 1,500 kilometers. So not thousands, 1,500. Never using the internet, never using a GSM network. They're sending it using ham radio networks. This is an incredible sort of fusion of hackers and people who want to protect the land and protect the lungs of this planet. So I just think that this type of creativity is extremely, extremely important. I think we live in a world where people want to support themselves and their communities, but we also have to think on the planetary, which is, the new term we use for the global in academia. We want to think on the planetary. And all of these things are extremely possible. And here's where I want to end. If we can get back to the basic question, all right? I think we all know this. We all feel this. Look at how much energy I have just seeing all of you, despite not having slept for one full day. I mean, a little bit. We all have the capacity. We recognize despite the increase in alienation, in loneliness, in isolation, much of that tied to social media, but much of it tied to many of my students, they ask me, hey, professor, why did my parents have me? Why did my parents have me? Why did they have me in this world with this pandemic, with these terrible environmental issues, with like no real thriving job market available, even for a UCLA graduate? Why do they have me? And then we just sit together and we show love and compassion with one another, because that's what it is to be a teacher, is holding space. It's not because I know anything and I could just throw things down people's throats. It's sitting and holding space together. And this relates very much to some, I will call it technology all of us have, which are spiritual practices, religious practices, faith-based practices. And I don't even mean that in a sort of dominant religious sense, but we have so much within us where we have always cared about much more than ourselves. And we also know as human beings, if we just stay and do it all alone, we get depressed and messed up. We see that with the fentanyl epidemic in the United States and the opiate epidemics before with OxyContin and so on. We are not alone. We are not alienated. There's a whole new vision of technology, getting back to the technology even of the breath, of the spirit, the technology of care. I'm deeply influenced by Buddhism, you probably can tell. And my teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, who's been a teacher to many of us, he says this. He says, this is the lotus, it's so beautiful. And then many of us talk about the mud. The mud is so ugly. Oh, it's mud, it's muddy, it's dirty, it's slippery. The lotus comes from the mud. There is no lotus without the mud. There is no mud without the lotus. So the point I want to end this with is that we have many capacities to care beyond the self and build systems that can lift all beings up. What was described as externalities before, referring to the work of Elinor Ostrom and others who've influenced me as well. We have so much that's possible. What we need to do is re-embrace a few things. Interconnection. We are not beings that are isolated and alone. More than ever on the planetary level, everything has odd fusions, right? I think there are speakers from Armenia, from Mongolia. Me, am I South Indian? Am I American? Am I like some weirdo from the whole planet? Am I from the cosmos? Probably all of it, right? We all have that, right? And we have, most importantly, care and creativity. That's what we have as human beings. I'm asking us all to double down on what makes us human, but more generally, what makes us alive. And ask questions about what technologies of life look like, rather than technologies of sort of individuation and closure. So I think we can get there. I really do. That's why I'm here. So let's do it together.